Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Tom Griffiths, who's an assistant professor at Berkeley. He'll be speaking today about Bayesian topic models. He's done a variety of other interesting work on cognitive science, which I encourage you to talk to him about later today if you have a slot. And so welcome, Tom.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. And thank you for having me here. So the things I'm going to talk about today are actually joint work with a bunch of people, but I'm going to single out these three guys: Mark Stivers at Irvine, Dave Blei, who was, I think he was an intern here a few years ago. He's now an assistant professor at Princeton, and Josh Tenenbaum, who's at MIT. And I wanted to provide a little bit of context before I start talking about topic models in particular. So what I'm interested in general, as Chris was saying, is cognitive science, and in particular making formal mathematical models of human cognition. And not just sort of coming up with mathematical models that describe something about what people do, but trying to understand how it is that what people do relates to how we can make better algorithms for solving the same kinds of problems. So, the way of doing this is to think about cognition in terms of the computational problems that people are solving, and then think about how we can go about solving those problems, what the ideal sort of solution to those problems might be, and then comparing human cognition to those solutions once we've figured out what those might be. So for a lot of the things that people do, things like making inferences from data, learning language, learning causal structure, the kinds of problems that we end up formulating are statistical problems, and the kinds of solutions that we come up with are things that come from statistics, the same kinds of solutions that people pursue in statistical machine learning. So what this does is actually give us a kind of connection between human learning on the one hand and machine learning on the other hand, where a lot of the problems that we care about understanding in cognitive science, things like how people form categories and use those categories, are things that we can understand in terms of ideas that come from machine learning and statistics, like Bayesian classifiers and density estimation and discriminative models. For something like causal learning, we can use things like graphical models. For something like function learning, we can use regression. For how people represent and use language, things like probabilistic grammars. Or for understanding human memory, we can look at ideas that come out of the computer science literature and information retrieval. So the point of making this kind of connection is that what it does is give us a couple of ways of thinking about a relationship between human learning on the one hand and machine learning on the other. So, one of these ways is that we can take ideas from machine learning and use them to explain human learning. And whenever I talk to anyone who's in machine learning, they think that this is clearly a good idea, right? The things that we figure out as smart machine learning algorithms are things that psychologists should know about and should use in terms of explaining how the mind works. But the other way that we can hope that this works out is that we can take ideas from human learning and use them to make better machine learning algorithms. And there's at least two ways in which this can happen. So one is by thinking about the fact that human beings are actually the best examples we have of systems that can solve certain kinds of problems that we care about. Things like using and learning language are a good example where human beings are the best system that we have for learning language. So maybe we can learn something about how to solve those problems by studying people. But the other part of this is just that thinking about the kinds of capacities that people have is something that can lead us to think about new computational problems or ways in which we can expand the capacities of our machine learning algorithms. And ideally, this kind of interaction should go in both directions. So what I'm going to talk about today is a sort of small piece of this picture, and that's a piece which is about trying to connect ideas about human memory to ideas that come from information retrieval. But perhaps a more concise way of saying what I'm going to talk about is by using an analogy to work that's done in computational neuroscience. So one strategy that people have recently adopted as a way of trying to understand how the brain works is by taking what's called natural statistics, the information about the world that the brain receives as input, developing algorithms that can analyze those sort of statistical information, and then looking at the output of those algorithms when they're applied to the kind of data that the brain receives. So this is a simple example of this, using input, which are images of natural scenes, using an algorithm to analyze this, which basically makes an assumption that what you should be doing is trying to construct a sparse code where relatively few neurons are active in response to any particular scene. And then looking at the kind of representation that comes out of that and showing that this representation actually has properties that are like the kinds of cells that you see in V1. So the idea here is that by taking input, which is the kind of input that the brain receives, and then postulating some hypothesis about the way in which that information is encoded, you can test that hypothesis by looking at the kinds of representations that you get at the end of the day, and whether those representations look like the kind of things that you see in the brain. So it would be nice if we could do something like this as a way of studying something like human cognition rather than how the brain works. And the sort of underlying philosophy here is a philosophy of sort of getting data that's like the kind of data which the system receives. So for many cognitive tasks, a sort of natural source of statistical data might be something like language, right? So if we think about the kinds of data which we get, which are data that people encounter every day and that influence the way that we reason and so on, one really nice available source of data is documents that describe different kinds of things, the kinds of things you could find on the internet or in natural language corpora. And the question that comes up is a question about, basically filling in these two question marks. What sorts of things we think should be extracted from this information? So how the natural statistics that are expressed in language are represented in people's minds, and what sort of procedures we could come up with that would allow us to talk about how that information is extracted. And that's really the motivation for the work that I'm going to talk about today, although it's something which has natural applications in a lot of areas of information retrieval and natural language processing. So what I'm going to talk about is one way of answering this question. And that answer is using something called topic models, which I'll explain in a moment. You can think about these as postulating a way of representing the information which is contained in the statistical structure of language, so the sort of information that we could extract from a set of documents. I'll talk about one specific model, latent Dirichlet allocation, and a specific algorithm for solving this problem of extracting that information from documents, and I'll go through that in some detail and show you then how we can use the output of that to make predictions about human behavior. And then I'll kind of return to the theme of thinking about the things that people can do as a way of challenging the sorts of models that we come up with in machine learning, and talk about some ways in which this basic model can be extended to capture some sort of richer capacities and remove some of the limitations of the basic topic model. And then I'll wrap up with some general conclusions. So topic models are basically a kind of probabilistic generative model for documents. So it's a kind of model, it's a hierarchical Bayesian model, which means that it's a model where we're going to assume that we've got lots of individual data sets and that there are going to be some parameters which are shared across those data sets. So in the case of a topic model, the data sets are going to be documents, and the parameters that are going to be shared are going to be the topics that appear in those documents. And the basic idea is that we're going to use these topics to give us a way of efficiently estimating multiple probability densities simultaneously. So if you think about each document as representing a probability distribution over words, what we want to do is build a model which uses some common structure between those documents to allow us to construct probability density estimate for each of those documents, but also has some special structure which is specific to every one of those documents that captures the information that's contained in that document. So we can do that by specifying a simple kind of generative model. We make an assumption that each of the documents we see is a mixture of topics, where a topic is a probability distribution over words. So the way that a document is generated is by going through that document, choosing a topic for each word that you're going to see, and then choosing a word from the distribution over words that's associated with that topic. So every word in that document will be chosen from a single topic. So what that gives us is a sort of simple equation which we can use for describing the probability of seeing a particular word in a particular document. And all that this says is that what we do is we add up over all of the topics the probability of the word, given that it comes from topic J, multiplied by the probability of topic J within that document. What makes this kind of generative model powerful is that these topics are going to be things which are going to be shared across documents. So from one document, you're extracting information which is going to allow you to efficiently encode the information that's contained in another document. And this is the property that makes this a hierarchical Bayesian model. The other aspect of this is that the weights of those topics is going to be what's going to vary across documents. So we're getting out information about things which are common to all documents, the topics, as well as things that are unique to each of those documents, which are the weights of those topics in those documents. And this gives us a pretty general way of then talking about how it is that two documents might be similar or different by just comparing the topics that appear in those documents. So this idea of constructing a model where we say that we're going to think about a probability density as being represented in terms of a mixture of probabilistic topics is a pretty common idea in NLP. It turns up in a lot of different models. And I'll talk about one specific model later on. But just to give you a sort of intuition for how this works, we could imagine a world in which there are only two topics that people talk about. love and research. I don't know if that accurately characterizes Microsoft research, but so in this world, say we've got 10 words, and the love topic gives high probability to words like heart, love, soul, tears, and joy. The research topic gives high probability to words like scientific, knowledge, work, research, or mathematics. And we can use these topics to generate a whole bunch of different documents, right? So these topics are going to be constant. But we can get a range of different kinds of documents out by changing the weights that we assign to those different topics in different documents. So we can get a document that's all about research by assigning a weight of 1 to the research topic and a weight of 0 to the love topic. One that's all about love by assigning a weight of 1 to the love topic and 0 to the research topic. Or one that's about how much you love research by assigning a weight of 0.5 to the love topic and 0.5 to the research topic. And what this means is that as you go through that document, the way that each word is generated is by flipping a coin. And then, it comes up heads, you choose a word from one topic. It comes up tails, you choose a word from the other topic. So this is a kind of simple way of describing the underlying generative model. You can talk about this model in lots of different ways. So if you prefer to think about things kind of geometrically, it has a very clean, elegant sort of geometric interpretation. So here, what I've done is said, well, maybe we can just think about all of our documents as assigning different probabilities to 3 words, say tears, love, and research. And we can then represent each of those documents as a point on this simplex, right? This simplex is going to represent the space of all of the probability distributions over these 3 words that you could see. So every document that we see is going to be represented as a point in this space. So if you represent things in these terms, then what we're doing when we're defining a topic model is basically trying to identify a set of topics which are going to be points on this simplex because they're also probability distributions over words that basically allow us to express all of those documents as things that can be generated by interpolating between those topics, right? So if we mix these topics to different extents, we end up with different examples of different points in that space, and those points in the space can generate the documents that we see. So, formally, one way of thinking about this is that what we're doing is we're given documents which are going to be the actual points which those documents are going to correspond to on a simplex of actual words are going to pick out a much smaller part of the space than the whole space. And what we're doing is searching for a set of topics which is going to allow us to define basically a subsimplex, a smaller, lower dimensional simplex within that higher dimensional space, where we're able to do pretty well in terms of expressing each of the documents that we actually see as a point in that subsimplex. So this is very similar to ideas like finding a set of basis vectors like you see in principal component analysis. And because of that similarity, it also has a nice kind of linear algebraic sort of expression. What we're doing is a kind of matrix factorization, where what we want to be able to do is estimate these probability densities over over words, where every document has a probability distribution over words. And we're going to do that by taking this matrix of probability distributions and factorizing it into 2 parts, where one part is a probability distribution over words given topics, and the other is the probability distribution over topics for given documents. So these 3 interpretations, 1 as a generative model, 2 as a kind of geometric kind of basis identification procedure, and 3 as a kind of linear algebraic construction, 3 different views of the same kind of underlying model. But the basic idea is that what we're doing is a kind of dimensionality reduction. That we're going to take this rich sort of high-dimensional data, which are the information contained in our documents, and then seek a lower dimensional representation for that, which allows us to capture correlations that existed in the original data and pull out the actual sort of coherent clusters of words that co-occur together. And the idea is that we want to be able to do this in a way which is probabilistically well motivated, right? We can then come up with, having defined a generative model, we can use statistical methods to work back and figure out what this structure should be. So these sorts of models have several nice properties. So just 3 which I think are particularly important. The first is that the topics that we get out are things that are going to be interpretable. So if you think about this in terms of something like dimensionality reduction, then you could find any basis for a set of documents, but there's no guarantee that the elements of that basis that you find are actually going to be things which make sense. The way that this model is defined in terms of using probability distributions gives us a gives us a sort of bias towards finding solutions which are actually going to be interpretable solutions. So what we end up pulling out are things that look kind of like this. So here, each of these columns corresponds to an individual topic, and each of the ordering of the words that appear in those columns corresponds to the probability of those words given the topic. This is the model applied to a corpus which consists of extracts from school books from first grade through the first year of college. And these are typical examples of the kind of output that you get. These aren't hand-picked ones. But what you can see is that it pulls out pretty coherent sort of sets of information that go together. This is, I think, a 1700 topic solution for those data. So each of these topics corresponds to one dimension in this solution, but the fact that these, we can look at these and actually make sense of what they mean, means that we can actually build sort of tools that use topics and allow people to go through and browse documents based on topics and sort of have their own interpretation of what the topics mean. And we've actually built a number of systems which use that kind of information as a way of allowing people to browse through collections of documents. Second property is that the way that the topic models are defined, they actually do a very good job of capturing words that have multiple senses. So if you think about the fact that we've got these interpretable topics, then you can capture the fact that a word has multiple senses by it belonging to multiple topics, right? We'd hope that those topics would hone in on the senses of words. And this is, going back to that example that I showed you before, the word field appears in 4 of these topics and in 4 different senses. And you can actually sort of see by looking at these examples that it's picking out senses that correspond to a sort of electromagnetic kind of field, a field of science, a baseball or football field, and a field of endeavor, right? So by having this kind of representation where we can say these are separate interpretable topics, we can also say these are separate senses in which this word occurs. But the third thing, and this is the thing that I'm going to really emphasize in this talk, is that we actually have a well-formulated generative model. And this gives us basically lots of tools that we can use for inferring topics from documents, using sort of, tools that come from statistics that have been developed for other kinds of generative models. But also it's something that allows us to extend this model in lots of directions. And I'll talk about some of those directions later on. But in terms of the kind of question that I started out with, a question about how we can talk about the kind of representations that we could think about people extracting from the statistical information that's available from documents, it gives us one answer that we can explore, right? That what we could have is the idea that from this sort of information, people are able to extract some kind of representation that captures these correlations between words, and that a topic sort of based representation might be something that we can use to actually make predictions about what people are doing when they're using these kinds of statistical information. Okay, so we still need to answer this question about what we can actually do to infer these topics from documents. And in order to do that, I'm going to get more specific and talk about a particular topic model, Latent Dirichlet Allocation. So this is a particular generative model. It was originally defined by Blei and Jordan. And this model, this is the graphical model corresponding to that generative process. So this graphical model basically spells out exactly the generative process that I was talking about before. It says that in order to generate a document, so this plate refers to a document, refers to all documents. So for any document, then what we do is we first sample a distribution over topics for that document. And then within the document, where ND is the number of words that appear in that document, we choose a topic assignment for each word based on the distribution over topics that we've selected for that document. And then for each of our topics, we need to generate a distribution over words associated with that topic. And then based on our topic distributions and our topic assignments for each word, we generate a word based, using the topic distribution corresponding to the topic that we've selected for that word. So this kind of format is common to many topic models. What makes this model distinctive is the use of Dirichlet priors on these distributions over topics given documents and the distribution over words given a topic. So this makes the model a fully generative model in the sense that we can say what the distribution over topics will be. So we can say, if you're going to see a new document, then it's going to have this probability distribution over, over topics has this probability. And because these priors actually allow us to do some kind of regularization and estimation. So because we're doing a kind of unsupervised learning here, the choices that we make for these priors are actually going to have big implications in terms of the information that we recover from the data. So our goal is going to be to recover estimates of theta and phi, and those estimates are going to be influenced by the assumptions that we make about these priors. So I'm sure many of you have seen this sort of model before. Just to give you an intuition for what these priors mean, our Dirichlet priors are going to be distributions over multinomial distributions. So if you sort of have seen before beta distributions used as, assigning a probability to the weights of a coin, right? So that's a binomial distribution. This is just a generalization of the beta distribution to allow us to generate multinomials. And the parameters of our Dirichlet distribution, called hyperparameters, are going to determine the kinds of distributions that this prior sort of makes more probable or less probable. So this is just an illustration using the beta distribution. So here what we're generating is a parameter theta, which would just be the weight of, say, a coin, right? So we're deciding whether we're going to see a fair coin or a coin that's biased in one direction or another. So this is just a probability, a weight that ranges between 0 and 1. And for each of those probabilities, we have some associated density. And the way that we assign those hyperparameters is going to determine what expectations we have about the weight of the coin. So if the hyperparameters are equal to 1, then that basically corresponds to a uniform distribution. It says that we'll allow any of those weights of the coin and consider them equally likely. But if the hyperparameters are greater than 1, then what that does is say that we're going to expect to see values that are sort of focused towards some point on the simplex, right? So there's some point on the simplex where they have highest probability, then it's going to fall off around that. So in this case, if we take our hyperparameters to be equal to 10 for both heads and tails for our coin, then we get a distribution which is centered on 0.5 and falls off on either side. And as those hyperparameters get higher and higher, we get more and more and more focused on that central point. If the hyperparameters are less than 1, then the behavior is actually the opposite. What you see is that the mean of the distribution will always be equal to the ratio of the hyperparameters. But as the hyperparameters get smaller, the way that the variance increases, because what's happening is that we're saying that we expect the value of theta to be something that's either very close to 0 or very close to 1. So one way of thinking about what this distribution says is that we have an expectation that we're going to see a probability distribution which is kind of at one of the sides or the corners of the simplex. Right? It's something where it's unlikely to be in this region where theta or 1 minus theta are large, but it's likely to be in a region where theta or 1 minus theta are small. So one way of thinking about this is to say that this is a prior which favors a kind of sparsity in this distribution. Right? It's going to like situations where lots of the values of our multinomial are going to be close to 0. And that's going to be important in terms of using this as an unsupervised learning algorithm. And I'll sort of give you some intuitions for that later on. Okay, so this kind of generative model is one which has relationships with many other kinds of generative models that are used in machine learning. So the aspect model is very closely related. It's the same sort of model without the Dirichlet priors. But it also has connections to principal component analysis, to models which use a Poisson likelihood. It's very closely related to non-negative matrix factorization or the GAP model, and I can tell you about these sorts of things if you're curious. In statistics, this kind of model has been around for about 30 years. It's called a graded membership model. And people are now using the same kinds of techniques as I'm going to talk about for estimating these things in statistics. And exactly the same model was proposed in population genetics for actually figuring out the composition of populations, where here you'd expect that there are going to be certain types of individuals which are going to have certain probability distributions, and then you can figure out the mixing of those individuals based on sort of the same kind of deconvolution from some observed data. So this basic idea is one that's actually pretty common. And as a consequence, there's actually also a lot of ways of inverting the generative model. So of going from observed data, documents, back to the topics that generated those documents. So you can use a standard EM algorithm to do maximum likelihood estimations. There are a number of deterministic approximate algorithms, so variational EM algorithms, and an expectation propagation algorithm. And there's also a variety of Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithms for doing approximate inference. So the way that these algorithms work, they define a Markov chain which has the distribution that we want to sample from as its stationary distribution. and then run that Markov chain for long enough that it gets close to that stationary distribution, and take samples from the Markov chain and use them like samples from the stationary distribution. So this gives us a way of generating samples from these relatively complex posterior distributions that we're going to want to work with. So there's a full Gibbs sampler which represents all of the parameters of the model, which was developed in the population genetics setting. What I'm going to talk about is a collapsed Gibbs sampler, and I'll show you what that means. And I'm going to talk about this not just because it's something that I came up with, but because it's actually a very simple algorithm that is very easy to implement and can be optimized very easily. And it's also one of the most, it's the algorithm which has been applied to some of the largest data sets. So this has actually been used to analyze, for example, topics that appear in Wikipedia. So Ray Bunting actually did some simulations using our algorithm for this relatively large data set. So the basic idea behind the collapsed Gibbs sampler is that we can use a property of the Dirichlet prior, what's called conjugacy, which means that there's a direct relationship between the prior and our likelihood. So that the conjugacy relation is just that the posterior distribution that we'd end up with on our parameters is going to be of the same form as the prior. But it also means that we can complete certain kinds of integrals. So in particular, what we can do is take our probability distributions over topics and our probability distributions over words given topics, which depend on those parameters phi and theta, and we can actually integrate out those continuous parameters and just end up with a distribution which is defined on the discrete variables, the variables which tell you which topic a word has been assigned to, and which are these parameters z. So what we end up with is we integrate over theta, the probability of z given theta, we integrate over phi for the probability of w given z, and we end up with this kind of nasty looking equation. So these gamma functions you can just think of as a kind of a generalized factorial function. So this is just a more efficient expression for something that's actually sort of even nastier. But this actually gives us something that we can work with very easily for doing things like computing conditional probabilities, or in principle computing a posterior probability. So integrating out these continuous parameters, what we've done is defined a distribution on an ensemble of discrete parameters. So this is kind of like models that you might see in statistical physics, where you've just got a lot of discrete variables that are weakly coupled with one another, and what we want to be able to do is sample from this distribution which is defined by these two terms. The reason why we want to sample from it is that while we can actually in principle do Bayesian inference by saying, well, we're going to observe a corpus W, and what we want to know is the topic assignments for the individual words in that corpus Z, and we could do that by multiplying together some likelihood which we can compute with prior, which we can compute. The issue is that in order to do that, we actually would then need to normalize it, and the sum which is used in normalization is over, if we have t topics and n words in our corpus, it's got t to the n terms. So we actually can't compute this large discrete sum. So what we end up doing is using a sampling algorithm which doesn't require us to have a normalized probability distribution. And the Gibbs sampler, a kind of Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithm, has that property. So the way that this works is basically that, in general, the way you define a Gibbs sampler is as the Markov chain that's produced by taking each variable that you want to sample and sampling it from its conditional distribution given all of the other variables. So in this case, what we're going to do is have this long vector of assignments of words to topics and go through and pick a word from that vector, and based on the assignments of all of the other words, work out its conditional probability of being assigned to any individual topic, and then resample from that distribution and let it go. And then do the same thing again and let it go. And the same thing again and let it go. And this defines a Markov chain for which the stationary distribution is this posterior distribution that we want to get out. And the nice thing about this model is that the conditional probabilities that we need to compute are actually very easy to obtain. So you can do a little math from the joint distribution that I showed you and work out that the conditional distribution for the assignment of a particular word, given all of the words in the corpus and all of the other topic assignments, just reduces to the product of two terms. So it's proportional to the product of one term. So this is the number of times you have seen this particular word type in this particular topic divided by the total number of words that have been assigned to that topic. And then these are some smoothing terms that come from the Dirichlet prior. And then the second term is the number of times you've seen that particular topic in that particular document divided by the total number of words in that document. So you can think about these two terms as actually corresponding to the probability of that word given that topic and the probability of that topic given that document. And those are the two things that you need to put together in order to work out the probability of that topic assignment for that particular word given all of the other assignments. And you can see that what this does is basically weakly couple our variables. Our variables are only coupled together through these counts, right? So all that we need to be keeping track of is the number of times we've seen a word in a particular document, the number of times we've seen a topic in a, sorry, the number of times we've seen a word in a particular topic, the number of times we've seen a topic in a particular document. And that basically means that there's no kind of tight correlations between variables. It's very easy to work out what this distribution is. And it ends up being much more efficient than a standard Gibbs sampling algorithm. So Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithms can vary a great deal in terms of their efficiency, both in terms of the work you have to do to compute your transitions and the rate at which these things converge. And this sampler actually turns out to have nice properties on both of those. So the first thing is that all that we need to keep track of are these counts of words by topics, topics by documents, and you can do that in two sparse matrices. So there's no memory problem here. All that we need to do in order to actually run the algorithm is sample from this distribution repeatedly, and you can see that there's no special functions in here. All that we have to do is some simple arithmetic. And if we want to get back information about the distributions on phi and theta, we can actually compute those distributions analytically from this ensemble of z and w, and then we can sample from those distributions as well. Yeah.
So do you have a hard assignment at the topic of the document?
So what happens is that at each point, we're going to have a hard assignment, and then those are going to change stochastically. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I'll show you. This is kind of a little sort of walkthrough, right? So what we do is we start out with some initialization, which is a hard assignment of word topic assignments for every word that appears in our documents. And in principle, this doesn't matter in terms of, because this is a Markov chain, it'll converge to its stationary distribution regardless of the starting point. In practice, it's good to do this in a way which guarantees that you're going to be closer to the posterior distribution rather than farther away. Once we've got our initial assignment, what we're going to do is go through and resample those assignments. So for the first assignment, what we do is we want to compute this equation, which is the equation I showed you before, and the counts that we're going to use for doing that are the counts that correspond to the assignments of all of the other variables in our model. So we resample, so we work out this probability and then generate a random assignment, and then we're going to sample the next topic assignment conditioned on all of the counts from all of the preceding variables, including the one that we just sampled, right? And then this goes on and on and on. And the idea is that while we have a hard assignment at each of these points, what we get after some number of iterations is going to be something like a sample from the posterior distribution. And by aggregating over those samples, we get out information about the probability of assigning a word to a particular topic. So just to give you a kind of visual illustration of how this works, we can use an analogy where we say, what I'm going to do is show you a bunch of images. You can think about those images like documents. And each of the pixels in those images is a word that could appear in that document. And the intensity of that pixel in that image reflects the frequency with which that word occurs in that document. Okay, so this is just a simple analogous case. But what we can do now is express our topics as pictures, right? And our documents as pictures, and then we can see how well we're doing in terms of recovering those topics from those documents. So here, we could take these 10 topics, which correspond to horizontal and vertical bars, and then what we're going to do is for each of our documents, we're going to generate some mixture of those bars and then sample each of our increments in intensity from, we're going to first sample one of these topics and then based on the topic, choose which of the pixels we want to update. Right? It's the same generative procedure. But this just gives us a way to visualize how the algorithm works. So this is 100 images generated using that procedure for those topics. And you might be able to see they're a little barry, but it's not particularly clear what generative process is used. What we do is we take the algorithm and apply it to these data. And what it does is it starts out at some relatively random configuration. And then over time, what it's doing is a kind of soft constraint satisfaction, where it's saying, okay, now I pulled out these bars here and these bars here. And you can get situations where you can see here there are 2 bars that are represented in one of the topics and so on. And it's just shuffling those topic assignments around and then gradually increasing the posterior probability so that what we end up with at the end of the day is a pretty clear representation of the data which was used to generate, the topics that we used to generate those data. Okay, so using this collapse sampler actually makes it pretty easy to be clear about the consequences of our choices for those hyperparameters. So these settings of alpha and beta actually turn out to be important to getting out reasonable solutions from the model. And one way of understanding why that is that these hyperparameters actually control the sparsity of our distributions over topics given documents and words given topics. So if you have alpha smaller, then you get fewer topics per document. If you have beta smaller, you get fewer words per topic. And if you think about it, what this is doing, because we're expressing our posterior distribution as the product of these two things, it's kind of trading off 2 kinds of sparsity, right? We're trying to find a solution which is sparse along both of these dimensions, where it's got relatively few topics per document, but also relatively few words per topic. And those are going to be good solutions in terms of maximizing the coherence of the topics that we end up getting. So the reason why we get this bias for sparsity is that just if you look at the forms of these equations, the gamma function appears in here. And you can see that if you look at like this term, if we're making a decision to increment a count by 1, then we're moving from a situation where we have a ratio of gamma alpha on gamma alpha to a situation where we have a ratio of gamma 1 plus alpha on gamma alpha. And over here I've actually plotted the log gamma function. Log gamma of x is a function of x. And what you should be able to see is that if x, the argument of gamma, is small, so this is the point where this argument is less than 1, then log gamma increases. So if we have a hyperparameter alpha set to something that's really small, then that's actually, having a 0 in our set of counts for the number of times a word occurs in a topic or a topic occurs in a document actually gives us kind of a boost in probability. This ratio of, this gamma alpha can be higher than gamma 1 plus alpha in the situation where you've actually got alpha being very small. So this is showing, this is where alpha is greater than 1. And you can see that there are going to be values where alpha is less than 1, where gamma alpha is going to be less than gamma 1 plus alpha. So what that's saying is that when you've got these values of alpha that are less than 1, the configurations which are going to have the highest posterior probability are going to be configurations that have as many zeros as they can tolerate, and then counts that are sort of as high as possible for the rest of the counts which characterize that multinomial distribution. So what this is basically cashing out is this idea that by setting this parameter in a way that sort of says what I want is one of these multinomial distributions that's on the edges or the corners of the simplex, we're building a model which has this kind of sparsity bias. And that sparsity bias is going to be the key to getting the kinds of solutions out that we want to get out. So because we're doing unsupervised learning, the way that we specify our prior on those parameters is going to matter in terms of the conclusions that we end up reaching when we analyze those data. So I have some simulations which demonstrate that if you're curious. But the basic point is that, now we've got a way of talking about the sort of representation we want to extract and an algorithm for extracting that representation. And it's actually an algorithm that's very similar to the kinds of algorithms that people have postulated are used by things like visual cortex. And that it has the same property of sparse coding, where we want to say that we have relatively few documents that encode, relatively few topics encoding a single document. And we're also going to say that we're going to have relatively few words being represented in each of those topics. So these sorts of topic models have been evaluated on a lot of sort of information retrieval tasks. And I'm not going to talk much about that. It's not work that I've done. What I'll talk about is the kind of evaluation that I'm interested in, which is looking at how well we can use these models to predict aspects of human semantic representations. So the way that we do this is actually using a task that's probably been around as long as psychology has been around. It's a word association task, where you give someone a cue, like the word planet. You ask them to name the first word that comes into their mind. And so for something like planet, people say things like Earth, Pluto, Jupiter, and so on. So the reason why we're using this task is that it's actually something for which there exist large amounts of data. So these guys, Nelson, McAvoy, and Schreiber, collected a 5,000 by 5,000 matrix of cues by associates, where every word that appears as an associate also appears as a cue. So it's a nice square matrix where we've got large numbers of associates, and it basically gives us a rough guide to the representations that people have in terms of the similarity, the associative similarity that they have between different words. So if people are doing something like paying attention to these statistics in language and extracting from that some kind of summary representation, we can test out different summary representations in terms of how well we can actually predict the associates that people produce from the cues that they see. So in terms of looking at these data, what we've done is compared the predictions of this model with latent semantic analysis, which is a leading model that's used in cognitive science, where we apply both algorithms to the tacit corpus, this corpus of school texts from first year of school through the first year of college. So this is a database. It's about 30,000 documents, 20,000 words, 6 million 20,000 word types, 6 million tokens. And both of these algorithms take the same input. So LSA also works from a matrix of the frequencies with which words appear in documents. And then we can use measures of semantic association we get from both of these models to predict word association. So you've probably seen latent semantic analysis before. It's also called latent semantic indexing. The basic idea is that it's something which is going to work from the same data but apply a different kind of algorithm to yield a different kind of representation. Although the underlying idea is still the same one of doing some kind of dimensionality reduction. Now what we're going to do is try and find some kind of representation of these words as points in a semantic space. And this too has an interpretation as a kind of matrix factorization. So here the factorization is done using the singular value decomposition. And the constraints on the matrices we get out are different. They're not constrained to probability distributions, but the idea is a similar one. So from these different models, we can actually come up with different ways of predicting the strength of association between words. So from LSA, we can actually get the cosine of those words, where we take the vectors corresponding to the words, take their inner product, and normalize by their length. And from the topic model, we can compute conditional probabilities. So if we make an assumption that our words come from the same topic, we can work out the probability of one word given another word. And the way that we do that is just by working out what topic each word was likely to come from, and then summing over that distribution over topics, the probability that it assigns to the other word. So using these two different measures, we can then look at how well the rankings of words that are produced using these different measures correspond to the words that people actually produce as associates. So for every associate that people produce, we can identify where it appears in the ranking that's produced by these different models, and then we can work out things like the median of those ranks or the distribution and so on. And I'll just show you some basic summary data. So these are data showing the consequences of using different kinds of topic models versus LSA. So for each of these, what's going on along this axis is this is the number of the associate. So this is the first associate, the thing that people produce most often in response to a cue. This is the thing that's produced the second most often, the third most often, and so on. Then these ranks are taken out of 5,000 words. So this is looking at the median rank of the associates that people produce within the ranking which is produced by the different algorithms. And then the first two bars correspond to the best predictions that come from latent semantic analysis across a variety of dimensionalities. And this is using both the cosine and just the raw inner product. And the rest of the bars come from using topic models of different dimensionality. But what you can see is that pretty consistently, the topic models end up producing better predictions than latent semantic analysis. So this is about a 40% improvement in terms of the median ranks that come out of the models. Another way of looking at this is you can just look at, say, the first associate and the probability of actually getting that first associate as a function of the number of words that you recall. And here, LSA is the red line, so it has a consistently lower probability than the topic model, which is the blue line. So this is working from exactly the same data. All that's different is the algorithm that's used for extracting this representation, but the topic model is giving a consistently better representation. And here the improvement's about 30% or so. So the last thing that I really wanted to talk about was the fact that because we have this nice generative model, we can actually push this model in lots of directions that allow us to talk about extracting more complex kinds of structure from data. So the kinds of extensions that we've looked at are extensions that kind of remove some of the basic limitations of these algorithms. So for example, when I talked about using these models, I said, okay, as input you have a set of documents, right? And then you're going to learn from that set of documents. But actually, there's no need to do that. So if you think about some kinds of data that you might want to model, something like a meeting, which is just an ongoing sort of stream of discourse, where it seems like there should be topically coherent segments within that meeting, but you don't know where those segments are. We can actually define a model which removes this assumption that you know where the document boundaries are and automatically infers those at the same time as inferring the topics. So the basic idea is that what we do is take the basic topic model, which is this part, and we add in essentially one more variable. So what this variable does is it's a switch. And it says that what happens is that over time, people are producing utterances. Those utterances are characterized by some distribution over topics. With some probability, that distribution over topics is the same as the previous utterance, and with some probability, it's a new distribution over topics, and it's sampled from a Dirichlet distribution as before. So by doing this, what we're doing is introducing one more latent variable, which is essentially marking where the document boundaries are going to be. And that means that we can apply this model to large, unsegmented text, or also things like meetings. So there are a few challenges in modeling meetings. They're much more noisy data than documents. But the basic idea here would be that we take input data like this and then try and figure out where the points are in these data, which are the points at which people are changing the topics that they're talking about. So this is a hand-annotated corpus of meetings where the annotations indicate the points at which there's a change in the topic under discussion.
So in this case, you have to impose the minimum constraint, the length, duration constraint, not to make it.
Yeah. So this model that I'm going to show you results for is the simplest model that we looked at, which just says you flip a coin for each utterance. Yeah. The algorithms the models that give us the best performance make an assumption like the one that you're talking about. So I talked about this switch, just being something you flip a coin for. You can define any distribution over ensembles of values for those switches, right? And those distributions, the ones that actually work best, are ones that say, you want some kind of length penalty or something like that. Okay, so what we get out of this kind of model is information both about the topics that people are talking about and a posterior distribution giving us the probability of there being a boundary at any particular location in the meeting. And these are results from one of our earliest models. We actually have much better results now in terms of predicting these segmentations. And the key to that turns out to be that you really want to make some pretty strong assumptions about the points at which you find boundaries. We've also developed these models in a way that allows us to incorporate discourse features, like people saying, so, or having big pauses, or things like that, and that also improves performance.
So how much better is topic model over HMM? I know that HMM over power.
So we get, I'm not sure about the numbers for the segmentation performance, but we do have, so this is some quantitative results just for looking at the coherence of the topics that we're able to extract. So there are two things that you want to be able to do, and one is segmentation, and the other is being able to actually pull out coherent topics. And you could do those things by running an HMM for segmentation and running a topic model to get your topics. And basically, so this would be if you just ran a topic model, just breaking up the corpus, and that works okay in terms of giving you topics. It works pretty much as well as our topic segmentation, but what we get out is the HMM gives you sort of less coherent topics because it's just modeling with a single distribution rather than a mixture. But what we get out is both the topic segmentation and the actual topics themselves. And this is psychophysical ratings. People just sit down and say, that's a coherent topic, that's not a coherent topic. Although we do get higher segmentation performance, it's using the PK measure than the HMM. Okay. The second thing that we'd like to be able to do is not have to fix the number of topics that we sort of go in with. And this is something that is reasonably easy to do. So there are a few strategies that you can use here. One is running models at different dimensionalities and then using the samples that we get out to compute things like Bayes factors, which just tell us the probability of a model of that dimensionality explaining the data. You can also use non-parametric Bayesian methods to solve this problem. So basically defining a prior which doesn't limit the number of topics which are going to be expressed in the data, and then allowing the data to determine effectively the number of those topics that you end up using. So the idea is that effectively there could be infinitely many topics, but what you're doing is defining a model which allows you to have some finite number being expressed in some finite data set. So you can do this in a couple of different ways. You can fix the number of topics per document, but leave the number of topics per corpus unlimited. Or if you leave the number of topics unbounded in both documents and corpus, then you get back the hierarchical Dirichlet process, which is one of these non-parametric Bayesian models. Something related to this is actually learning systems of organized topics. So, a basic assumption of the model is that topics are going to be independent, but in fact, if you think about the kinds of topics that we really talk about, they're things which can fit into a hierarchy where you can sort of change the level of abstraction. And we can do this using the same kind of non-parametric Bayesian tools. So the idea would be that what we'd want to be able to extract is a hierarchy like this, where at the top level we have, say, words that appear in all documents. Then at the level below that we have words that appear in some documents, and at the level below that we have subtopics of those topics. So the basic idea is that instead of saying that any document has a mixture of any topics, we say that document has a mixture of topics that lie along a path through this tree from root to leaf, and then mix those topics up in some proportion. But what this allows us to do is to say some of the topics are going to be pretty specially unique to that document, others are going to be shared by other documents, and some are going to be shared by all other documents. So this kind of model for fixed hierarchies is actually originally defined by Hoffman and Pazuka. But we developed methods for actually simultaneously learning the topics and the hierarchies using these non-parametric Bayesian ideas. And the basic idea is that if you think about it, learning a tree like this is the equivalent of learning a number of topics just iterated at multiple levels. So we define a process called the nested Chinese restaurant process, which defines a distribution over partitions and then subpartitions and then subpartitions and subpartitions, which allows us to effectively say, at each of these points there's an infinite number of branches that you could follow, but you're going to follow existing branches with probability proportional to the number of times they've been followed. And effectively, for any finite data set, you'll see a finite number of branches being expressed, and those finite number of branches define the underlying tree. So this is just an example of applying this model to the NIPS corpus. This is 12 years of papers from the Neural Information Processing Systems Conference. And what we actually pull out are, at the top, the kind of stop words, things that appear in all of these documents. The next level, there's a distinction between things that are actually about neurons and things that are about machine learning. Anyone who's been to NIPS knows that there's a mix of these two things there. And then below that, neurons divide into sort of silicon versus cellular. And then machine learning divides into things like speech recognition, reinforcement learning, neural networks, and theory. So the theory topic is just math, right? So, okay. We can also do things like model authors as well as documents.
So in that case,
Yeah.
how do you deal with the mathematical equation?
Yeah, they're just reduced to symbols. Yeah. It's from the So, the way that I've talked about documents, we don't have any extra side information, but for lots of corpora, we do have side information. Things like who the authors of a document were, or other sorts of things that you might want to incorporate in building your model of that document. So the author topic model is a model that actually incorporates information about authors. And the basic assumption is that we're going to say that each author has a probability distribution over topics. So when you decide to write a paper, you make some decision about the topics that are going to appear in that paper. And for each word in a multi-author document, the author of that topic is chosen at random. So what this does is induce a distribution on the topics that will appear in that document, but it's using this latent variable, which is the actual topics, which are the things that the authors write about. So for any given document, what we get back are assignments of words to topics, also assignments of words to authors. And then from those assignments of words to authors, we can figure out what it is that individual authors write about. So this is just an example. These are 4 topics from this NIPS corpus. And you can see that there's some correspondence between, this is a sort of probabilistic topic here, versus, say, a support vector machine topic here. And you can see that the people who appear with high probability in those topics are also the people who you would expect to appear in those topics. We can do some fun things with this model. So what we've done is some experiments where we take abstracts from 2 different papers, glom them together into one document, and then put both of the authors of those documents as authors of that joint document and then try and see how well we can do in figuring out who wrote what. So this is an example. So here at the top, this is an abstract that was actually written by Bernard Scholkopf, and at the bottom is an abstract that was actually written by Adnan Darwish. And what we've got are blue for Adnan and red for Bernard. And you can see that we're actually doing pretty well in terms of identifying who wrote which of the words in this made-up document. So most of the reds on the top and most of the blues on the bottom. So the last thing that we've done is actually look at taking these topic models and increasing their sensitivity to word order. So the basic model is a bag of words model. It doesn't make assumptions about word order. For one way of thinking about the way in which we can incorporate word order, a very simple way is just to say that the words that appear in documents can appear for two reasons. And one is that they're topically relevant. The other is that they're there for some kind of syntactic purpose. So we can do this by building a joint model where we say that there are two causes of a word appearing, and one part of this is this kind of semantic topic model. The other part is this more syntactic. So here we use a hidden Markov model, a probabilistic regular grammar. And these are the two things which can lead to a word appearing. We actually assume that the way that this works is that we have our hidden Markov model down here, which has its normal syntactic states, but also has one special semantic state. And when it hits the semantic state, what it does is emit a word from a topic model that's appropriate to that document. So one way of thinking about the way that this works is that what it's doing is saying that we're going to have two kinds of statistical dependencies that appear within a document, within the words in a document. And one is this kind of short-range dependency based on the hidden Markov model, which is fixed across all documents. And the other is a long-range dependency between words within a document, which is produced by this semantic model. So what we're doing is trying to identify a factorization of the words that appear in our documents into those things which are in all documents and appear in a sort of reliable way versus those things that are in only specific documents and capture the variation across those documents. So you can think about this, syntax and semantics is a little strong. Another way of thinking about it is that this is kind of function words and this is more of the content words. So again, the previous examples I showed you of topics were extracted using a stop list. These are topics that are extracted using this model without a stop list from the same corpus, and you can see they sort of look equivalent in terms of pulling out the semantic information. But what we also get out are the kinds of things you get out from using a hidden Markov model, like rough syntactic classes, things like pronouns and present tense verbs and so on. But what's defined as semantic and syntactic is going to be context dependent. So it's going to depend on what things vary across documents and what things remain the same. So for example, if we run this on the NIPS corpus, then it turns out that function words include model, algorithm, system, case, problem, and network, and so on. So we can use this for, again, doing some interesting things. One example of this is highlighting and templating. So we can figure out for any given word what the probability is of being assigned to those different components. So at the top, I've highlighted the words for a particular abstract which correspond to the high probability content words. And you can see we're actually pulling out a lot of the sort of meaningful variation here. On the bottom, I've shown just the words which have a high probability under the function word model. And you can see that this actually gives us a template for an IPS abstract. So it says, we compare the blah of the blah blah composed of competing blah blah suggested by someone, 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 and Hinton to the blah of a blah 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 on a complex but low-dimensional blah blah blah. So this might just be a property of NIPS that you can do this, but okay. So I'm going to wrap up. So just to return to this sort of general idea of human learning and machine learning interacting. I mean, here this is more in spirit than in practice, in that we've taken this sort of idea from machine learning and shown that we can use it to make predictions about human cognition. And the reverse direction is more about sort of thinking about pushing these models in directions that bring them closer to human capacities. But there are some kind of themes here which are important themes that turn up in this endeavor of doing computational cognitive science. So one is this idea of hierarchical Bayesian models, right, sharing parameters across data sets. And this is valuable in cognitive science because it helps us to explain how people can learn to learn, right? So how you can learn from one thing and it can inform your learning in a future setting. And we've looked at using this same kind of hierarchical Bayesian models in other settings like categorization and causal learning, where we might say that people have some kind of underlying causal theories that they use to learn about causal structure in specific cases and so on. A second theme is this idea of sparsity, right? Or more generally, the idea that priors are going to matter in unsupervised learning. And this is something which we've been pushing in terms of, in particular, using linguistic models. So this is joint work with Mark Johnson and Sharon Goldwater, looking at using the same kinds of priors in other more sophisticated language models, things like PCFGs. A third point is Monte Carlo methods, right? So we had some kind of complicated posterior probability distribution. We can do inference in this model using Monte Carlo. And this is a general principle which we can use in lots of settings. From a cognitive science perspective, it actually gives us two things. One is hypotheses about how people could be solving some of these challenging problems to the extent that we can make connections between these Monte Carlo methods and cognition or neural processes. The other is it actually gives us a way of thinking about getting information about the representations that people have in their own heads. So one of the things we've been doing recently is running Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithms with people, where we have an experimental task that's like one of these Monte Carlo algorithms. People go in and they answer questions in like a sort of iteration in a Markov chain Monte Carlo algorithm. And so we can start people out in sort of these perceptual spaces. This is a space of stick figure animals, and they kind of do a random walk in this space. This is their random walk where they're deciding if something's a giraffe or not. And what we get out is a set of samples from their distributions. So this is their distribution of giraffes, and you can see that it includes giraffe-like animals. But the fourth sort of theme is this idea of non-parametric Bayesian statistics. And thinking about cognitive science, this is a nice idea because it gives us a way of going beyond the kind of limited models where we say, okay, we're going to fix the dimensionality, to models that are able to grow in complexity as we get data. And this is something where I think there's a lot of opportunity for machine learning to grow. In particular, developing ways of using these sorts of ideas with different kinds of representations and with richer sorts of models. And so, I've been doing some work looking at different kinds of stochastic processes that we can define that allow us to talk about different kinds of representations which can grow in this way. So this is a prior which works for binary matrices of unbounded dimensionality. And there are similar kinds of things you can define for other sorts of representations. But in terms of the specifics I've been talking about today, I guess the main points are the idea that topic models are going to be a flexible class of models you can use to capture the content of documents, that we can use Dirichlet priors as a way of expressing sparsity in multinomials, and in particular in these topic models, that if you're using these sorts of models, there's a class of Monte Carlo algorithms that are pretty simple to implement and pretty flexible in terms of what they do. You can extend them to other aspects of language. So we actually, all of the examples I showed you used exactly the same kind of sampling algorithm for inference, and that we can use these ideas in a broad range of settings, and going beyond the kinds of examples that I've been talking about to other aspects of language as well. So thank you.
So do people ever think of using diagrams rather than single word as the basic unit to all analysis that we have?
Yeah, so
mathematics that you did, obviously
right.
you know that.
Yeah, so Mark Girolami had a model which is like that, which is using bigram statistics. In general, this principle of, so any situation where you want to estimate multiple probability densities is a situation where you can use a topic model. So n-gram models are an example like that, right, where you really want to estimate many probability densities simultaneously, and you want to share some statistical strength. So it's a way of doing smoothing. It's not necessarily the best way of doing smoothing for every problem. So you need to think about whether it's got this kind of natural decomposition. But yeah, so Mark Girolami's done a bigram model, and some of those models have been used in things like modeling motor control, where you want to sort of talk about dynamics rather than particular actions. Yeah?
In the video where you did experiments that show the median ranks, how do you actually select the specific hyperparameters? And is it that it works for a broad range, and then as soon as you make it into the non-sparse sort of version, it falls apart? Or how
so that's a great question. So the results I showed you are with one set of hyperparameters, and they were the first set that we tried. So I think it would be good to do exactly what you're suggesting in terms of looking at if we go out of the sparse regime, showing that things fall apart. We have sort of gone closer to 1 in the hyperparameters, and it does get worse. But I haven't gone all the way and done that systematically. That would be good to do. Yeah.
So it's sort of very impressive to see how this sort of extends towards syntax, but the meanings themselves are still kind of, just basically just a single topic. And clearly the words within a topic all mean different things, right?
So I think what you can think about a topic as is if words belong to a topic, that just gives you a kind of a piece of information about some kind of exchangeability of context, right? That there's a context where you could use any of those words and it might be okay semantically, right? Just like a syntactic model like an HMM gives you exchangeability of syntactic context, right? That's what a part-of-speech sort of notion is.
So actually, I mean, in the non-sort of model-based work in computational linguistics, what people have noticed is that depending on the range in which you look in these windows, right, you actually get different classes of words coming out.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there's any way of putting in...
Yeah, so this is all operating at the document level. So that one way of thinking about that is that you're expressing information about what long range means, right? In terms of, if you think of the topic model as, it doesn't care what order the words appear in the document, it just cares that they're in the same document. If you're making that more constrained, I'd expect that you'd be picking up more syntactic, sort of dependencies as well. I think that way of combining topics and syntax is one way of doing it, which is not the general answer to how you should make these models sensitive to word order. So this is what it does is this function content thing, which is fine as one dimension of talking about how it is that, syntax and semantics interact, but it's clearly not what you'd want in terms of being able to say what this word means depends on the order of the words in which it appears. And it would be interesting to think about whether there are ways of generalizing the models that would allow them to do that kind of thing.
There's been interest in sort of long-range dependencies for a while, and but I think that Chomsky would talk about how you couldn't do WH movement with an n-gram model. But if you're interested in, say, Shannon's type problems like perplexity, guessing the next word, strict adjacency seems to be more important than long-range dependencies.
Right.
And even if you look at WH movement, the vast majority of WH movement is sort of string vectors.
Right.
And getting to this question about, how much do topics matter versus n-grams, it seems like there are different phenomena where strict adjacency matters more. So if you want to play the Shannon game of guess the next word, probably the strict adjacency stuff dominates the topic constraints, although obviously there's signal and close. If you wanted to do word sense disambiguation, it kind of depends on what the word senses are you want to disambiguate. If they're basically part of speech distinctions, you want to use a shorter window than if they're sort of more like IR type questions. And this whole question of what's the bandwidth of the window seems to get into sort of these no free lunch theorems about how you can have the primary frequency at the same time. That and it seems like focusing so much on the sort of document level questions will answer a lot of interesting questions you couldn't do with strict adjacency, and maybe Chomsky couldn't have done with syntax. But are we just looking at different parts of the element, or is there a grand unifying theory that would combine long range, short range, and
well, I think there probably is a grand unifying theory which would combine all of those things, but it's not clear how much of an improvement, say, on a Shannon game you're going to get by adding in something like this sort of long-range dependency, right? So, I mean...
So you wouldn't be claiming that you could be an n-gram model?
No. Yeah, no, I don't think that would be... but I think that it might be possible. So, to the extent that there's any signal contained in these kind of document-level correlations, then you'd expect that you could get some boost out of that if you engineered it correctly. And that would be, if you're just thinking of...
Probably a second order effect.
Yeah. It's going to be small in terms of predicting what the next word would be. But if you're thinking about, the way that I think about this being interesting is that what it gets at is an aspect of human language processing, which is that we're able to extract the gist of a document, right? We're able to say, here was this document and here are the things that it was about, where it's this kind of, it's not really semantic in the sense of man bites dog versus dog bites man, but it's semantic in the sense of what people were talking about. And that's what you're able to capture with these models that you wouldn't necessarily be able to get with like an n-gram model. It's these kind of broad, global sorts of things. So I think that where you think the different models are going to be useful are in terms of thinking about what kinds of representations are relevant and what kinds of questions you want to be able to answer. And this is answering, a pretty different kind of question from the n-gram kind of question. So in sort of psychological terms, this is something that gives us information about, say, associations, but probably wouldn't give us information about things like reading times, right, where people are reading through a sentence and getting things which are ill-predicted by the previous.
So like a closed net.
Yeah, right.
It's not going to work well there.
Not particularly well, yeah. So, and I think it's worth thinking about these different kinds of representations and the different kinds of tasks that they correspond to.
So on the switching topic extension of the basic model, the one you talk about.
Yeah.
So people work on the switch which is continuous,
Right.
variables. Then adding that switching actually turns the otherwise tractable model into intractable. People have to use all variational learning styles, and then it's very hard to do any computation. In your switching here, everything is discrete.
Yeah.
Does it create a lot of computation problem, or is it just
No, it's just one more variable in the sampler. Yeah, and it works just as well as.
So you don't have any continuity constraint somehow when
Yeah.
you switch. So that
No.
things have to happen.
It's just one more thing. What it does is it changes the scale at which correlations are introduced in some of these. I don't think that we've had any problems in terms of it's a little bit slower because you're sampling one more variable,
But it's not exponential.
but it's not exponential. Yeah. Yeah.
Can this model generate article?
You want to write papers with our model? So we generated some NIPS abstracts before, which was funny because I actually had a poster on this at NIPS, and one of our abstracts was something like learning with kernel equivalence, and then I went around the corner and someone had their poster on learning with the equivalent kernel, and I was like, damn, if only we'd nailed that word order thing, we'd have had a paper. So no, I don't think we can quite write your papers yet. Yeah. But the templating sort of thing gives you a way of being able to do that, right? Where you can say, take an abstract, extract a template, fill in the blanks with words generated from another topic. And that works pretty well. Yeah.
This is a bit more of a philosophical question, but I mean, what do you think is the explanatory power actually of models like these? So, for example, you could compare LSA and your model versus a nice big data set of word association data from humans. Now, you're clearly better than LSA, but have you actually learned anything about human cognition there, or do we just have a more sophisticated, better model that fits?
So I think the big picture question is the same thing. It's this idea of dimensionality reduction and sensitivity to natural statistics. What I actually think the difference in terms of the claims of the two models is something I didn't go into detail in here, but we actually looked at some qualitative consequences of using different representations. So LSA has this kind of spatial representation, whereas the topic model has this, topic-based representation, which is more like a kind of featural representation. For every word, it has some set of topics that it belongs to. And because of using the spatial representation and the cosine, which is basically a monotonic function of a metric on a space, you can prove that LSA makes some commitments to things like triangle inequalities and other sorts of things that you can then find evidence against in the human data. And the topic model doesn't do that because it's got this feature-based sort of representation where, if you have, so a good example of a triangle inequality is, asteroid is similar to belt, and belt is similar to buckle, but asteroid and buckle aren't similar, right? And you can come up with lots and lots of those. So, this is a problem if you've got 3 points in space, then if you've got a metric as defined as the way that you're measuring similarity, then you should get some similarity as a consequence of that. But if you say, well, here's asteroid and it's in one topic, and here's belt and it's in two topics, and here's buckle and it's in one topic, then these can be similar and these can be similar, but these can be completely dissimilar. So those were the things that we actually focus on in terms of saying, well, maybe here's an alternative way of thinking about how we can extract a representation in the same way as LSA, but not subject to the same sorts of constraints. Yeah?
I wonder if, because I really like where you have the syntax and the semantics. Have you ever thought of applying that to coreference resolution, where coreference is also NP coreference? It's been very hard and most successfully attacked by lexical cohesion.
Mm-hmm.
It
Yeah,
might be a nice
I haven't thought about it,
application
but it might be nice to talk about
area. It is.
Yeah.
There are some tests.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about it.
I believe your colleagues at Berkeley have a paper on this.
Yeah, Carmen.
Oh.
So in using Gibbs sampling on these models, are there cases where you have to worry about the Markov chain not converging? Or,
Yeah,
getting
every case.
Yeah.
So, so we don't have any mixing time results on these Markov chains. They're simple enough that I think you could get them, but you can get mixing time results for models without data, but we don't have mixing time results for models with data. So the question of whether it's converged is an empirical question, and I think for large data sets it's probably not. But there are two things that you could want out of an algorithm like this, and one is it's something which works in practice and allows you to extract good representations. The other is it's something that actually allows you to sample from the posterior distribution. If you're a statistician, you probably care about the second one because you want to say, here's what you're justified in believing is true given the data. But if you want to build systems or make predictions which are at least close to the predictions that come out of the posterior, then the first one's okay. And I think that's the regime that we're in. But when we do this, we actually run multiple chains, check that those chains are hitting the same sort of general vicinity in terms of the posterior probability that they're crossing and things like that.
So it doesn't look like it's a big problem in
Yeah, it's not really getting stuck in local maxima. The kind of the way in which it's not necessarily converging is that it goes up very rapidly, and then it hits a point where it's very, very slowly changing very small amounts, and that regime seems to go on for a long time. So, it's a Gibbs samplers. Convergence is geometric in general, and that's what you get into is this kind of, very, very small sort of changes.
Roughly how long for how much data does it take?
I haven't run it on a modern computer. So we have a not particularly optimized C implementation that you can run on, I think we run it on 12 million words in a day or so. I mean, I think and that's on a 2 gigahertz machine or something. So there's lots of, you could really tweak it, and Ray Bunting has actually really tweaked it and run it on 100 million words. So, yeah.
So for a task like the 5,000 by 5,000 word association task, would it be feasible to consider collecting more data instead of being fancier about how you smooth?
Right.
And what if you did something simple like just using pointwise mutual information based on Google page counts or whatever?
Yeah.
How does that compare with?
So that's a good question. So I don't know about that particular thing, but I do know.
Is it just hopeless to get enough data for that?
So we looked at just computing conditional frequencies within our corpus, right, and using that as a baseline, and that we get median ranks of about 18 out of the topic model, 30 out of LSA, and 50 out of the conditional frequency. So as I've seen other models that have been applied to larger corpora, sort of giga-size corpora that have been used to make predictions for these data, but I haven't actually tried them out using exactly the metric that we use. But my guess is that, getting more data would make things better, and that what we're looking at here is sort of a difference in terms of how you're extracting the information and how you're smoothing. I don't know how those two things would trade off, though.
Right. But it might be that we're just getting so much data that
Yeah.
fancier about how to use the data.
Right. Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Yeah. Yeah, it'd be good to test that out. Yeah.
How would you determine the form of your prior? I mean, is there to use different kinds of prior?
You mean human priors?
Yeah.
Oh. You want to, okay, so that's I can show you a cool method that we have for doing this. So basically I kind of think that most of the questions that we care about in cognitive science can end up being questions about what people's priors are. So questions about what people can learn and how long it takes them to learn it and so on. And using Bayesian models, there are two ways that you can answer that. So one is you can give people data, look at the conclusions that they make, and then say, okay, what priors do you need in order to make those conclusions? The other thing you can do is use the idea that people are Bayesian and then try and design tasks which are going to explicitly provide you with information about their priors. So one thing that we've been doing is using a task which has this property. So this is a sort of schematic form of cultural evolution called iterated learning. The idea is that, if you think about how you learn language, the way that you learn language is by somebody else giving you data, and that person also learned language, and that person, learned it from someone else who produced data, and so on and so on. So you can think of these sort of games of telephone, right? And it's something that's called iterated learning in the language evolution literature. So you can analyze what happens in iterated learning if we assume that our learners are Bayesian learners. And what they're doing is sampling hypotheses from their posterior distributions and then generating data from their likelihood functions. And you can prove that this process of iterated learning is something that should converge to the prior distribution. So the probability that a learner uses a particular hypothesis converges to the prior probability of that hypothesis. So this is interesting in the context of language evolution, but it also gives us a way of analyzing what people's priors might be by putting them in the lab and getting them to play telephone with data. So I'll show you an example of this. So this is a function learning task. We give people data that are basically XY pairs. The hypotheses that they have to entertain are functions relating those variables. And what they're going to do is see some data, and I'll show you the format we give them the data. They make predictions of Y for new X values, and then we use those predictions as the data we give to the next learner. Okay, so this is how we show them XY pairs. This is X, it's the blue line. So they see like a bar, and they're trying to learn how the length of this bar predicts the length of this bar, right? And they adjust a little slider. But we can actually give them different initial data, and then they should converge to the same distribution over time, and that distribution should tell us what their biases are like. So if we give them initial data that's a positive linear function like this, then they'd see these data, produce predictions like this, right? We take those predictions and give them as data to the next learner, and they produce predictions like this. And then we take those data, give them as the data, those predictions are the data for the next learner, right? And so on. Okay. So the positive linear function survives, right? What's interesting is that if you start with a negative linear function, you also get a positive linear function. If you have a nonlinear function, you get a positive linear function. If you have just random noise, you get a positive linear function. So we've done this like 32 times, and we get a positive linear function 28 times, and a negative linear function 4 times. And this is actually consistent with data saying that people find positive linear functions easiest to learn, people find produce responses consistent with a positive linear function to start out with, and the best models of function learning have a bias towards positive linear functions built in. So it actually seems like this is pretty reasonable as a characterization of what people's priors might be for things like these functions.
How does it differ from one person to another? Is it
yeah, so we have those sorts of data for some other kinds of structures. So we've done now a lot of these experiments where we get people into the lab and then basically feed back their data to them, their responses as new data, and then the stationary distribution of that reveals whatever their biases are. And we do find some individual differences, but for something like this, people are pretty consistent. We actually did an experiment using these kind of stimuli, which are, what people are doing is they're trying to sort of find sets of, here these amoeba vary only in their internal nuclei, and you can construct different classes of sets of amoeba that vary along 3 dimensions. So this is a classic stimulus set used in psychology. So this class 1 is just a 1-dimensional rule, class 2 is a 2-dimensional rule, and then like class 6 is the parity function on 3 binary variables. So here we did find individual differences. We did this experiments at Brown, and we found that most people find class 1 easiest to learn than class 2 and so on. And then students from RISD, which is the art school, really like this one. So, so there were some meaningful population variation. Yeah.
You know about the beer game?
The beer game?
Yeah, it's a management exercise where they put a whole bunch of people in series, like a wholesaler and retailer and all this, and then they are supposed to issue order supply requests in both directions.
Yeah, my dad does this. Yeah.
Right. And they start with a simple step function, and it creates these wild oscillations with amplifiers. So everybody's always ordering too much or too little. And I suspect that what you have here is a sort of simplified version of
Right.
it. But if you put that in combination with, if a bunch of people all were connected and they all have these errors,
Right.
then
Then you could multiply and...
you get terrible things.
Yeah, that's cool. Okay, I'll look it up.
Do you have any of these experiments with language?
We have one experiment sort of with language. So the problem with doing language is that people are already know English in our subject pool. So that means that the biases that we get out aren't necessarily representative of their actual language learning biases. This is an experiment that we've been doing on cultural evolution of color terms. So if you look across languages, there's a remarkable amount of consistency in the way that languages divide up colors with different terms. And we've been looking at, we know that the biases of individual learners correspond pretty well to the systems of colors that you actually find across languages. So we've been looking at whether this process is enough to bring out those biases and allow them to be expressed in the population, and whether the distributions that we get out match up with the distributions you see across languages. So this is the color chip array used in the World Color Survey. What we've done is started chains with, say, 2 color terms, different configurations, hue, lightness, and just a random configuration, and then looked at the kinds of solutions that come out of those. So now subjects go down in this data. So for 2, you find that there are 2 relatively stable solutions. One is a hue-based solution, which is like these things, and you can see it comes out here as well. The other is a lightness-based solution, like these ones. And you can see our chains switch back and forth between hue and lightness. So if you look in, there's actually, I think, only one language with just 2 color terms, and that has a lightness-based distinction. And that seems like the higher probability solution here. With 3, we get hue here, 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 and lightness as well. So you can see there are lightness solutions showing up here and here as well. Although I think the hue-based one is more common across languages, but we're still collecting these data. So we're going to do some more syntactic, looking at artificial grammar learning, where there's a sort of known hierarchy of the difficulty with which people learn different kinds of artificial grammars, that we can actually see whether that's recapitulated in this kind of process as well. Okay, thank you.